So my intention was to be more scholarly, but I see that there's a few scholars and a few interested people, some old friends. So nice to see everybody. So Bob and Sami and Yoel, Shalom. Nice to see you, Daphne. So nice to see everybody. So, and Evan is there. Hello, Evan. So I was going to give kind of more of an academic paper, but I'll try and be a bit balanced. And I think essentially what I was going to argue is that there's a need for sort of a conceptual framework to understand anti-Semitism, to understand contemporary anti-Semitism in particular. And I think one of my criticisms of some of the literature, actually the majority of the literature, is that I find it's often descriptive, and people are doing empirical research and descriptive analysis, which is in some cases very important and in great detail and important to understand issues of contemporary anti-Semitism. But I think one of the weaknesses in the study of contemporary anti-Semitism is that it's not placed within a conceptual framework, and that we're using concepts and ideas in a way that's not really critical. So we're using, there's the very notion of anti-Semitism could be unpacked. I mean, what is anti-Semitism? Is it hatred against the Semitic people? Are the Semitic people a language group, a cultural group, a race, as the Nazis and the Germans and the Europeans classified Jews for centuries as a sort of a race, an inferior race? You hear the argument that sometimes people in the Middle East who are not Jewish can't be anti-Semitic because they are Semites as well as Jews. So we have ideas and concepts that I think are being used in an uncritical fashion. And I think there's some good literature on that. I think of Wistrich and other people have sort of unpacked the notion of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And then we're also living in a time when populism is increasing. So why in the United States of America is there such a threatening kind of conservative, a legitimate conservative reaction to the status quo in the United States? And also, beyond the legitimate conservative, even nationalist aspirations of some citizens in the United States, where is the line that is being crossed between I'd say neo-fascism, extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and bigotry? So why is populism in the United States emerging as an important social and political and cultural phenomenon? What are the conditions that create the situation where populism is increasing, and potentially we're in the United States and in other parts of the world, we're in for a rough ride, even in the next few weeks, and I suspect going into the future. So what is the condition that these type of movements are emerging using xenophobia, nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism, etc. So what are the conditions? So I think in a sense, there's some excellent work describing empirically what's going on. But in terms of the literature on anti-Semitism, I don't see much literature trying to critically examine why these trends are emerging. And I think this is the weakness in some of the work that's being done. And I think as scholars, research fellows at ISGAP and beyond, I think these are the questions that we need to understand. So in my training, I take empirical research very seriously. You have to have empirical data to analyze society or problems in society. But at the same time, I think it's important to have a conceptual framework that examines social, economic, cultural identity politics, and processes associated with it. So in the research that I've done, I've also looked at issues of globalization and its impact on cultural identity, on integration, and also on marginalization. And in a sense, I think I'll end with looking at issues of anti-Semitism and globalization. But in a sense, before I started working on issues of anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, I was doing a lot of work on social cultural policies and how neoliberal globalization was impacting on identity and socioeconomic processes within society. So what I would argue is that we need to have a comprehensive analysis and a framework to understand what is transpiring on the ground in societies. And as many people know, we're living in tumultuous times where things are changing, it would seem at some point, kind of rapidly. And anti-Semitism is often the fuel or even a core of the extreme ideologies that are attacking the democratic, if you want to call it, center, or trying to change society through different social movements and protest movements. So trying to understand the context is very important. And if I can just speak to myself about myself, so I came from a background looking at globalization and cultural identity and social cultural policies. So I looked at the history of social theory and the intersectionality with social policy. And I looked at Western social cultural policies from the times of colonialism up until notions of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism, and how identity has shifted. So during colonial times, there was a very strict ideological construction, social construction of belonging and otherness, of race, of blackness, of whiteness, and how that was sort of structured into Western civilization, into science, eugenics, social sciences, theology, that the other was portrayed and perceived in a very, I would say, unethical way, but in a very clear way. And we have with the, as the Europeans went out to colonize the world, as the ships were leaving, the Jews, and in some cases the Muslims, were sort of being displaced by Spain and Portugal and Europe, right? A third of the Jews were, the policy at the time was 1/3 was to be exterminated, 1/3 was to be exiled, and 1/3 was going to be converted, forcibly converted. So you have this taking place in Europe as colonialism begins to go sort of spread out from Europe. And of course, the Europeans and the civilization process of colonialism were quite ruthless in Christianizing parts of Africa and the Americas. There was these great debates in Spain and Portugal whether indigenous people in the Americas were even worthy of conversion. So the debate was, do you convert them to save them, or you eliminate them? That was the debate. Not, exploring as we do today, some of us enlightened people in quotations, of exploring the culture and the cosmology and the wisdom and the ethics and the practices of other civilizations and cultures. The debate was whether you exterminate or convert, right? So Elias's wonderful book on the civilizing process, and that was, and perhaps it still is, very much entrenched in Western thought. The idea that we have to change the other. And I was sitting in Israel in the early 2000s with sort of this background, fresh off the successes of the anti-apartheid movement and anti-racism studies and the like, a progressive critical scholar that I was. And I was teaching in Israel, and I started to, after, in the late 1990s, started reading Egyptian media and some intellectual work that was translated into English and French. And I started to understand that the Muslim Brotherhood and anti-Semitism was playing a very crucial role in sort of the Muslim Brotherhood and in political Islam. And for me, this was shocking. And understanding the linkages in political Islam, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, into Nazi ideology and European anti-Semitism. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the most pernicious form of anti-Semitism perhaps ever, this forged document that played a crucial role in spreading anti-Semitism throughout Europe. These conspiracy theories, the protocols comes out of France and Russia, depending on which historical account you have of the protocols. And you can see that the protocols, as Elie Wiesel said, the Holocaust never began with crematoriums and railroad tracks. The Holocaust began with words and ideas. And the words and ideas of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion justified removing Jewish people from society, putting them into and justifying ghettos, and justifying the final solution to save the white Aryan race, and in some cases Christianity, to rid the Jews. And in my reading of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I went to good universities. I was at McGill, University of London, and Oxford, studied political theory, social theory, and we never, as a collectively in a course, really explored the ideology and the politics of the Muslim Brotherhood. So in the late 1990s and early 2000s, this sort of whole issue kind of opened to me, in part by mistake. It was when Yasser Arafat in the late 90s was saying certain things to European audiences or in European languages and speaking very differently in Arabic to people throughout the region. And that's how I kind of entered into understanding the whole ideology of Fatah, of the PLO, of Hamas, and its source, the Muslim Brotherhood. Before that, I was completely ignorant of this whole area of research and knowledge. And I'll say two things. So beginning to understand the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranian revolutionary regime, Daesh, sort of, the root of political Islam is really in the Muslim Brotherhood. And understanding their ideology and its connection to European Nazism and fascism and European anti-Semitism. But what made this sort of journey also interesting is that scholars and intellectuals perceived any critical analysis of this reactionary, fascistic, genocidal, anti-Semitic ideology and reactionary social movement. Progressive intellectuals in the West often perceived any Jewish intellectual in particular dealing with these issues as somehow being an advocate, being an apologist for the Zionist entity. And in progressive intellectual circles, the Zionist entity is at best, largely at best, not entirely, but largely at best, a problematic entity that needs to be reformed, or a problematic entity that needs to be eradicated in order to save the region, in order to end the conflict in the region. The Zionist entity was problematic. It's a colonizing entity, it's an apartheid entity, etc. We know all the epithets. So the reaction to the study of a reactionary social movement often was silenced. It was problematic in the progressive, in quotations, kind of postmodern, so-called left circles in Western academia and in the media of record. So this is also an interesting phenomenon, and I think this relationship, the red-green alliance that some of us call it, also needs to be explored. Why is there a predisposition in Western scholarship today? Maybe it's changing slightly. I think there's more awareness of anti-Semitism and the threat that it poses to democratic societies. But why the reluctance to deal with contemporary anti-Semitism? So I think this is research on this subject should be empirical, but it also has to be conceptual. Why would a postmodern progressive critical group of scholars be predisposed to be sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is anti-democratic? Um, it's a religious-based social movement, and it calls for the elimination of Jewish people. It calls for the subjugation of women. It calls for the murder of gay people, and it calls for the destruction of democratic principles. So why would progressive intellectuals be sympathetic or silent to this reactionary movement, which is an anti-systemic movement and diametrically opposed to whatever a progressive postmodern intellectual would view things? But the only, I guess, commonality is both the postmodern and the reactionary political Islamists are anti-Western and anti-Western hegemony. They both, I guess, believe in decentering Western hegemony. So this is sort of the ideological and political commonality. So very quickly, and I don't want to get into this too long, but there's three phases of anti-Semitism that we deal with. There's the Christian religious phase, there's the racist phase, and it's now the attack on what Jews are as a people. And very quickly, what I think distinguishes anti-Semitism to other forms of hatred is Robert Wistrich and many other scholars, eminent scholars, Walter Licour, and others have pointed out that anti-Semitism is somehow inherently genocidal. And what I mean by that, if you think about it, during the period of Christian anti-Semitism, there was a belief, not always and not in every church, but quite consistently, particularly in Europe, that the Jews were blinded by evil or the devil or whatever it was at the time for not being able to accept the Gospels and the Christian notion of the Messiah. And there was a belief that the Jew or the non-believer that was blinded and not able to accept the Christian notion of reality, of the Messiah, that they would be condemned and incapable of any form of redemption, of spiritual redemption. But what makes anti-Semitism genocidal is that there was also a belief that if the fact that the Jews were not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah, not only would they not have redemption as individuals, but they were hindering the coming of the Messianic age or of world redemption. And this is where the genocidal tendency in anti-Semitism comes into play. When the dominant perspective or worldview of many people shifted from religion to race and science and nation and ethnicity and race and sort of biologically determined notions of identity, the Jew shifted from a religious problem to a racial and national problem. And in order to save the white Aryan race and the white nation, the Jew had to be eliminated. So unlike during the Christian period where the Jew had the possibility or the escape hatch, if you will, to convert to save themselves, to save their lives or save their soul. When it came to race, there was this notion that race was fixed. So like philosophers like von Herder and other Enlightenment scholars from Hegel to Descartes to others, there was this belief that race was something intrinsic in an individual. You can convert your religion, but you can't change the innate biological or ethnic or racial notions of somebody's essence, that the race and ethnicity was in the essence of somebody's character and physiological makeup. So you can't convert your ethnicity or your race. So the Jews were perceived as the Semitic race, the inferior race, and they were threatening the white Aryan race by poisoning its purity. So the Jew had to be eliminated. And the Jew was eliminated, and I think this type of racist anti-Semitism culminates in the Holocaust. And now today, I think these old forms of anti-Semitism, the Christian and racist forms of anti-Semitism, are not as prevalent, I would argue, as the attack of who Jews are as a people and the Jewish connection to the land of Israel and its cultural, religious, and historical ties to the land. And that Israel is a problematic entity, as I was saying earlier. It's criticized by the progressive postmodern left as being a colonial racist entity. The indigenous people, the Palestinians, were usurped by the Zionists, etc., etc. And that some would argue that Israel has to be eliminated in order to save or to usher in peace and security in the Middle East, that Israel is the problem, and that Israel has to be eliminated to save the region, if not save the world, that it's an illegitimate entity. And this is the sort of the precursor today, or the justification today, of anti-Semitism. So if Israel is an apartheid, colonial, illegitimate entity in the region, young Jewish people on campuses, people going to synagogues in Europe and North America or South America or the diaspora, particularly in progressive postmodern spaces like universities, the students and the faculty become problematic for being connected with Israel, with Zionism, and the like. And this is, in a sense, the dominant form of anti-Semitism, but as we all know, and if we didn't know until last week, it was driven home in Washington, where the attack on the Capitol included white supremacists and overt racist anti-Semites, as opposed to the postmodern anti-Semites. And I won't go into too much detail, but I think in a real sense that the sort of some of the intellectual giants of our time, of the university in our time, people who ushered in the era of postmodernity, people like Michel Foucault and Edward Said, the two examples, who were hanging out in France in the late 1970s with the exiled leaders of the Iranian revolutionary regime, perceiving what was beginning to emerge in Iran as an Islamic revolution that would be akin to what the French Revolution was to Enlightenment. Foucault and Said supported the exiles and the Iranian revolutionary movement, that they saw Iran as sort of ushering in an enlightenment, an Islamic enlightenment, similar to European enlightenment. And I think ideologically and conceptually, I would argue that that influence on the intellectual moment that we're in, why Israel is perceived and deconstructed as it is, or Zionism is, or Jewish identity as it is, comes from this sort of ideological moment. How Judith Butler, for example, can argue that Hamas and Hezbollah must be perceived as part of the progressive left, the global progressive left, to quote her accurately, to me is just astounding. How can a brilliant philosopher, which she is, who happens to be a woman, who happens to be a gay woman, who happens to be a Jewish gay woman, how she can, through her ideological lens, argue that Hezbollah and Hamas should be perceived as part of the progressive left is just
it's 15 hours.
Sorry, a contradiction, which is very striking to me. That when brilliant people begin to think irrationally, something must be up, and I think that this has to be, in a sense, deconstructed. I want to leave time for questions and discussion, so I'm going to kind of skip through some stuff here. I want to mention the crisis of modernity. So I think regardless of what we think about the crisis of modernity, we have to understand that institutions that play a key role, particularly the state, are under pressure. This crisis is affecting everything from the from the core to the political periphery. Those in the periphery are experiencing high levels of socioeconomic, political, and even and also cultural marginalization. In some areas of the world, the economic and political crisis is so severe, we begin to see where we're witnessing the so-called failing of states. So in some areas of the world, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, this has become prevalent. So why are states failing, and what are the implications of this? And what I find fascinating is that with neoliberalism, with structural adjustment that was ushered in during Reagan and Thatcher in the late 70s and 80s, there was this belief that if we can limit the power of the state and allow free markets to come into societies and to have more space to operate, that this would infuse capital, there'd be economic and social and political development, and this would usher in an era of more freedom and democracy. So what to me is fascinating is that after World War II, everybody, all the nations of the world, the leading nations of the world got together and said that we'll never have the social, economic, and political conditions of the interwar period that happened in Europe between World War I and World War II. That the levels of marginalization and differentiation, of class differentiation, of people being marginalized from institutions and power in society, that there was a prevailing view that this led to the rise of populism and nationalism and fascism. And that the world got together and said, we'll never allow those conditions to exist again, because we don't want to allow populism and nationalism to destroy Europe. After all, there were almost 80 million people killed in the Second World War in Europe. The infrastructure of Europe was largely devastated. And of course, there was the Holocaust. So the world got together and passed legislation and agreements that this would never happen again. There's the Declaration of Human Rights. In the Declaration of Human Rights, the world got together and said that people have a right to education, to healthcare, that people have a right to employment, that if in capitalist societies, there will always be unemployed people, that those unemployed, fragile members of society ought to be protected with access to housing and other basic necessities of society. But what happens 30 years later, in the late 70s and the early 80s with structural adjustment, is that neoliberalism said, no, let's have free markets and that will bring development and more democracy. And what's interesting is that the rise of political Islam also emerges in this period. And political Islam also wants to destroy the state. They understand the state as being a vestige of Western colonialism, and that the state is a Western idea that needs to be replaced with a caliphate or Islamic institutions and ethics and political conduct. So you have these two forces, two powerful forces attacking the state. Now, the state in places like Egypt provided basic education. It provided basic subsidies for food, for healthcare, flour, water. In more advanced countries like Canada and Western Europe, there was a good healthcare system, a serious education system. I went to McGill University as a Canadian citizen. I grew up in Montreal, and I paid 200 Canadian dollars, about $150 US a semester, to go to McGill, which is a top university ranked in the world. So education was perceived as a right. And if you were a good student, you went to McGill. If you weren't such a great student, you could go to another lesser university, but you would receive a strong university education and healthcare. We had some of the, I think, the best healthcare system, I believe, growing up in Quebec, probably in the world. So these things were perceived, and to some extent still are in some parts of the world, as a right, not a privilege. But as structural adjustment and neoliberalism and the ideology of free markets come into play, these values and institutions which held people together, it created a strong national identity. So even though there are cleavages, there was racism in some of these societies that had a strong state. There was anti-Semitism, there was gender inequality, there was class inequality. But at the same time, these institutions helped to cement a sense of identity. So even though there was a sense of nationalism in Quebec in which Jews and other minorities were not a part of the nationalist identity of Quebec, we still took pride in Quebec's good education and strong healthcare system and good welfare system and the rights of tenants to stand up to major landlords and corporations, that they had rights and they couldn't just be walked out over or evicted, or their rents couldn't be inexplicably raised without government codes of conduct being enforced. So the state was strong, identity was strong, but as the state weakens, more people have been marginalized, disconnected from institutions of the state, disconnected from the promise of modernization and development, put into, in some cases, abject poverty. And places like Egypt or in the Middle East and in North Africa and now in East Africa, where the state wasn't as developed and wealthy and powerful as Western Europe and Canada and other American societies in South America, the fragmentation of society and the pressure on the state was so great that states fail. And also the vacuum that was provided by this structural adjustment and neoliberalism, as the neoliberals were pushing to weaken the state, radical Islamists were filling the vacuum. And they started providing clinics and basic education where people were not indoctrinated into notions of modernity and enlightenment, but indoctrinated into notions of caliphate and very narrow views of Islam. Political Islam is not Islam. Islam is a very great religion and culture throughout the world. So but political Islam is a very specific ideology that fuses Islam with European notions of fascism and anti-Semitism. So you have this rise of reactionary social movements, which is also being aided and abetted, if you will, by neoliberalism. So globalization must be understood as a series of processes in which so I'm going to skip to, so globalization is a series of processes that divides as much as it unites. So it certainly brings people together. People are together perhaps as never before. These in particularly in the last year, perhaps in Zoom, university scholars, students, corporations, the interconnection of commercialized goods, of services, of products. People are consuming cars and clothes and cappuccinos and espressos or whatever, Starbucks, as ways as never before. So it's bringing people together in a very powerful way. But at the same time, it's also the people who are not gaining access to the internet, to electricity, people who are stuck in their places is also increasing. So dislocation and marginalization is also increasing. So in a sense, there's this notion of time-space compression that David Harvey used to talk about. So in a globalized world, the more time and space, or the faster you can cover time and space, the more globalized you are. It means you're on the top of these processes. So corporations that can change money and invest money to, at a click of a computer are at the highest end of globalization. Perhaps middle-class professionals like scholars who get to travel before the pandemic, get to travel 2, 3, 4 times a year and meet colleagues in different parts of the world, or those of us who are connected now, from around, I guess, North America, Europe, and Israel, I'm guessing where everybody is on this call, that we are somehow connected through our work or through as colleagues we've met in the past, so we can have these conversations. But there's a good chance, I'm in Oxford, and 2 miles from here, there's a kind of a housing project of marginalized people. Some of them are immigrants, some of them don't have citizenship. Even though they're very close to me spatially, I don't interact with them as much as I do with certain people who are in institutions like universities or philanthropists or policymakers around the world. So I'm covering more time and space, I guess, as a professional scholar. So in this globalized world, the more time and space and the faster you can go, the more globalized you are on the top of these processes. Those people who are stuck in time and space, those people who are in the suburb of Oxford, who don't get to travel and may not have access to uh, certain things that we have access to. People in shanty towns in developing countries that don't have sanitation and electricity and access to the internet, they're stuck in time and space. So globalization must be understood as bringing people together as never before, but also marginalizing people as never before. And I think this, 4 decades of neoliberalism and going away from the welfare state, going away from the Declaration of Human Rights, going away from the notion that everybody should have a bare minimum of living, of income, of subsidies, of education, of healthcare, of access to knowledge, access to housing, access to food, as that ideology or that model gives way to neoliberalism, we're seeing the rise of political Islam, which I've just spent a lot of time explaining. And I would argue also the rise of the radical left, which I think occupies spaces in the West, mostly in the intellectual classes and the chatting classes. The Red Green Alliance, which is, I would say, ideologically a profound contradiction. And now the rise of nationalism and radical right extremism. So I would say, in a sense, although the characters that stormed the Capitol last week or 10 days ago in Washington are repugnant characters, they're wearing Auschwitz shirts, who are overtly violent, racist, anti-Semites. They're kind of repugnant people. But at the same time, as scholars, why is populism rising? Why does Donald Trump or figures like Donald Trump in the United States and in many other parts of the world gaining traction and credibility? And I would say is because people are desperate. I remember, we can go and you can read wonderful books on globalization from David Harvey, Anthony Giddens. There's a lot of people want references to books on globalization, and this marginality I'd be happy to share. But I remember taking a train from New York City to Boston and trying to count the factories that were abandoned along the railroad tracks. And that desolation, that destruction of the industrial infrastructure of Western countries has been replaced by social services and financial services that some have benefited amazingly from. But at the same time, what happened to those good working class jobs in Europe and in the United States and in Canada? They've been replaced by, the service industry. And, one town outside of New Haven, Connecticut, not far from Yale University, where I used to be, had a bunch of factories, and the people of my generation, their parents did well. They had good working class jobs, they worked hard, and they provided for their family. Literally, all of those good working class jobs are gone. In Walmart, there's a big Walmart in this town. There are two executive jobs that local people have. And the rest, hundreds of people, are working for minimum wage in Walmart, either servicing Walmart or in Walmart. And people of my generation, 40, 50-year-old, mostly white people, American of white European origin, are living with their family. So now you have 3 generations of kind of dispossessed white people living with their family who were once a generation or two ago, a generation ago, kind of solid middle class, people. So you have these people voting for Obama, and you have these people now supporting Trump and supporting some of the more radical elements of this populism that is emerging because of the dislocation and the marginalization of so many people. And I think that, and Ira's going to make me end this in 15 minutes or so. So I want to wrap it up. But these are the conditions that give rise to populism and a deep sense of dislocation and marginalization, and not being part of these processes of globalization. That you can see these people can look to the fancy part of New Haven, Connecticut, and Yale. They can see what's going on in New York and LA and London and Berlin and Tokyo, and they see this sort of global culture, which is wealthy and slick, and universities in the United States cost $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year to send your kid to, and they're angry, and they don't have a future. And so, populism gives people easy answers, easy scapegoats. And I think, in a sense, to understand contemporary anti-Semitism, this is a long-winded way of saying that we need to have an appreciation and an understanding and an analysis of what's going on in society beyond the descriptive nature, beyond police brutality, beyond Black Lives Matter, beyond the Donald Trumps and the white supremacist anti-Semites. Why are these conditions emerging? What are the reasons for it? Why are the old, these old cleavages and ideology of hate re-emerging? And I think we need to have the descriptive analysis or the empirical data and research. That's essential. And it should not just be conceptual, but I think to really understand the reemergence of anti-Semitism and other forms of demeaning the other, whatever the other is, really needs to be understood, I'd say, in a more comprehensive way, understanding social theory and socioeconomic, political, and cultural processes. Okay, so that's my message. So I'll end it there, and I'll be happy to take questions or comments. Sami, go ahead. You're muted, but go ahead.
It's okay. Listen, what you're saying, it seems like a picture of what I saw in my own country, which is Venezuela, where all these forces came together and turned a country that had already a middle class of around 60 to 65%, still had a lot of poor people. But it was going forward, and all these frustrations happened, and this new populism came to power. And just to give an example on universities, because you talk about McGill, for example, in Venezuela, there were 5 major universities, huge universities with 30, 40,000 students each one in the 5 big cities. And that's how it was. There were many technical colleges, etc. The Chavez regime didn't build anything, actually founded 60 universities, 60 universities that they were starting to give degrees basically to anybody. You see, so because they said that everybody has the right to go to university and have a degree. And all of a sudden, they were graduating doctors, medical doctors, in 3 years. 3 years. And what that caused that all the medical profession that existed in Venezuela left the country, because they said, if we got to work with these people who don't know anything, they just happen to have a degree given by some state university that they are doctors, then I am leaving. And most of the medical professional in Venezuela, they left. So this situation, I have seen it happen. How can you destroy a country that was going forward? I mean, Venezuela wasn't going backwards; it was actually going forward, and it was a great place not only to live, not only as a Jew, but also as a Venezuelan, and as a regular citizen. There was a place where you could actually get ahead, lots of riches, natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. And what do we have now? So I'm afraid that if the world goes that way, I mean, we're going to have many Venezuelans in the near future, not in the long future, in the near future, because many countries right now, for example, have no resources to fight the virus. For example, you mentioned Israel. Israel, I mean, was caught with the virus, but it had 150 billion dollars reserves, which is the same reserves as Mexico has with 150 million inhabitants. So you know, there's no way that some countries can actually fight this. Now, how do we solve it? I don't know, Charles. I mean, we're looking to people like you to give us the answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Sammy. So, you know, there was a Canadian politician named Lloyd Axworthy, I think he's retired now, who proposed about 25 years ago that every international, that we've became global, you know, we're a global, we're interconnected, it's a global economy, it's a globalized world. So he argued that because this territory, the boundaries are more porous than ever before, and there's no going back, that every financial transaction in the world should be taxed a fraction of a penny, and that all this international taxation should go into a system where people are guaranteed the necessities of life: basic education, healthcare, unemployment, insurance, welfare, a decent place to live. And that if we descend into where we are now, he proposed this 20 odd years ago, 25 years ago, that if we descend into the situation where it's just a free market system and companies could relocate, they can create a factory in country X where the labor is a fraction of where they were originally located. And when labor starts to get organized and starts to increase, they can go somewhere else. That if we get into this sort of free market system where everything is sort of open and free, he argued it would be a bit fascistic in the pure fascist sense of the word, where corporations control everything, and that we would descend into chaos. And I worry. I mean, if you look at Venezuela, and if you look at Somalia, and if you look at Syria, and if you look at Iraq, and this list of failed societies is increasing for all sorts of reasons. But I would argue in large part because how do you sustain a government? How do you sustain law and order when so many of your citizens are just pushed to the side? So we're in a serious global crisis of modernity, which we discussed years ago at ISGAP. But I think now that, as you say, the pandemic, I think the pandemic economy is exacerbating all of these cleavages and contradictions in our society that existed, and it's just being exacerbated. So the people showing up, and January the 17th, by the way, in the United States is going to be an interesting day. As the Chinese curse says, we should live in interesting times, because you have these, right-wing vigilante, extremists who will be protesting all over the country armed on the 17th of January. So these are marginalized, angry people, and in the U.S. they're armed military style, some of them. So the anger and the dislocation has been exacerbated in this COVID economy, and I think these social, economic, and political phenomenon that existed before the COVID is just it's coming out in all sorts of ways. It's a dangerous time. Does anybody have a comment or a question, a criticism?
Doctor, it's a pleasure to talk to you. By the way, my daughter went to McGill.
Yes.
Wonderful school. I'm just wondering how much of anti-Semitism is a result of victimization. I wrote you this question on chat, that in societies where Jews, being a very small part of the population, had an inordinate amount of success and people blame them for their own failings. How much of that feeds anti-Semitism?
So I'm reading your question. That people feel because they're marginalized, they look to the Jew as a successful.
Yeah, and they're marginalized because they don't have the ambition, whatever. They don't have the wherewithal, and they blame the Jew for their lack of success, their lack of ability to succeed.
Yeah, so I think in this age of emerging populism and xenophobia and nationalism, people, the scapegoat plays a certain role in society. You have Charles Hill, who's a scholar at Yale, used to say, the more conspiracy theories there are in a society, that is an indication of its decline. And I think the amount of conspiracy theories and untruths that are part of the discourse these days is alarming. And I think it is an indication that things are sort of under tremendous stress. So yeah, you have a lot of anger, and scapegoats play a function for populist movements and reactionary social movements and demagogic leaders. So it's interesting how anti-Semitism morphs. I mean, it's extraordinary that Jews were exterminated not very long ago historically because they were not white, right? We were poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race, and we had to be eliminated. And that ideology and that history goes deep into theology, social science, philosophy, science. It was, deeply ingrained, if you will, into Western thought. Now, people are saying that no, that Jews are white, and not only are we white, but we're privileged white. And they're not saying it like, sorry for our mistakes for hundreds of years in which your people were raped, murdered, and pillaged, and victims of genocide, and subjugated and segregated. They're not saying it like, welcome to the club and we're sorry. They're saying, no, you're the ultimate problem, that you're whiter than the white people. You're a white elites. So yes, so this form of anti-Semitism is not just by these marginalized white people with guns storming places these days in the United States or nationalists in Hungary. This is also prevalent among people who claim to be enlightened, postmodern, progressive intellectuals. That the absence of any historical analysis, of any historical rigor and honesty and truth in these people's scholarship is mind-boggling. It boggles the mind. And what I think is endemic in Western thought, and this is a whole long argument, is this capacity for certain people to define the Jew. That the Jew has been defined in this part of the world for a long time. They were defined as the wrong religion. They were defined as the wrong race. We were defined as the wrong nation and the wrong people. And the ability for people, given the Holocaust, given colonialism, given the catastrophes that defining the other has brought upon the world and brought upon the morality and ethics of Western thought and history, the fact that these people, in the name of good, can now define the Jew, define Israel, define Jerusalem, it boggles my mind. Anyways, but that's a whole other story, I guess.
And may I say something?
Sure.
This is Joel Sheridan here.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, and to see you too. I'm glad that you actually used the word fascism a few times, nationally speaking. But it's a rare word in the United States, in America.
Yeah.
Basically, anti-Semitism, as you well know, is a euphemism which was introduced 150 years ago, about 1860.
Mr. Sheridan,
Because people were unhappy with the word Jew hater, which showed exactly who and what they were, and they
Mr.
hid
Sheridan,
behind the euphemism.
Yoel,
That's the thing.
Yoel, could you speak maybe closer to your microphone? It's difficult
Yes,
to hear.
okay. Yeah, I'm speaking to the screen rather than microphone. The anti-Semitism or euphemism was introduced by a German publicist, or Austrian publicist, in 1860 in order to disguise the word Jew hater, which the enlightened Europeans were uncomfortable with. And today, by the way, the anti-Semite is very uncomfortable with the word anti-Semite, because most anti-Semites deny that they are anti-Semites. They're anti-Zionists now, which of course is much more comfortable than being an anti-Semite. You can see these, because within the anti-Semitic language, what was one time with the other. I know from my own experience, people would say, it's not you, it's the others. Okay? Today, it's not you, it's those nasty Israelis over there, whatever they're doing with other ones. So we have a disadvantage if we try to fight this business called anti-Semitism, when we ought to, in fact, show the anti-Semit what he really is. And it's difficult because, as I say, he denies it. For example, in England, Mr. Corbyn denied entirely that he's an anti-Semite. And I've watched a few other seminars where the guy stands up and absolutely amazes, what do you call me, an anti-Semite? Look how well I deal with the Jews. So we're in the same difficulty here. But if we would relate it to what's happening in America today, where Mr. Trump showed his true colours, is that the other thing which people don't like to say is they're fascists. So you have extreme rights, you have populism, you have all these sort of things. You even have extreme left, which is basically right, not left. Because if you really analyse them, you know what the real left is. Marxism and other left and real socialism doesn't contain the fascist ideology within its ideology. It may behave like fascists, people do, because they usurp the position. And what has happened in America, Mr. Trump is the leader, he claims, the leader of a movement. He won't name the movement. It's not the Republican Party, it's the movement. And you will find many articles and otherwise saying how the movement will remain. Still, we will have one movement. It's an anti-democratic movement. And basically, what is an anti-democratic movement? It's a fascist movement. But they refuse to use this terminology. In other words, they won't, they use there's a proverb, an old English proverb, it says, give a dog a name. But we won't give it a name, no one will. I don't know why. I really don't know why. Partly possibly because capitalism and fascism go well together. But it's rather interesting, and I was very surprised to find that the leading corporations in America now have disavowed Trump and are, in fact, disinvesting from the Republican Party. It's quite an amazing result of what has taken place in America today. But I also would mention that in the historical feudalistic and medieval anti-Semitism, we're not concerned with the elimination of Jews. We were concerned with getting rid of them, so that because the Pope isn't a Christian religion, knows that the coming of the Messiah can only take place if there are Jews in existence, because the Jews have to
Mr. Sheridan,
recognize him. So we
Mr.
thought you can knock a few of them about. That's right. In that anti-Semitism. What happened? The other thing about it, which we don't recognize, is the hidden agenda with it. When they weaponize, I'll finish here. I will finish.
Okay.
They weaponize anti-Semitism for their hidden agendas. I'm not saying that Mr. Trump is an anti-Semite. He may not be, but he will use it, or the so-called right wing, or wherever it is, will use the anti-Semitic argument in order to achieve power. That's what Corbyn did in England when he got into the party there. And then when anti-Semitism becomes institutionalized, it's oy vey avoid, because that's what happened in Germany. By the way, the 1930 fascists were, if I may say, more honest. They had no problem in saying what they were doing. I hate the Jews. I don't like the Jews. I'm going to eliminate the Jews and do all this to the Jews. You don't hear that from the anti-Semite today. All he says is, I want to eliminate Israel, the state of Israel, eliminate it, which means, in effect, which is what is one of the most consistent elements throughout the whole of history of anti-Semitism, is the Jew has no unconditional residential rights anywhere. In the 1930s and 40s proved it most openly.
Mr. Sheridan, I'm sorry to be rude. I'm sorry to cut you off.
I'm finished.
But no, thank you very much for your insights. We appreciate it. And unfortunately, we have to go. Ira has been texting me. We have another seminar. If anybody's interested, Ira can tell you, we have a seminar starting in about 20 minutes. And also we'll be back next week with our research fellows are starting a seminar series as well. So Ira can tell you about the upcoming event in 20 minutes. I'm sorry to cut everybody off, but we have to open another Zoom channel to allow the other professors to come on.
Thank you for your patience and thanks for the seminar.
Thank you for joining us today. We will be on another Zoom channel. The link's in the chat box for our Latin America International Seminar Series with Dr. Matthew Hone, and we'll be back next Monday with Benjamin Weinthal as well. So please join us then, and we appreciate everybody joining today, and we'll see you all soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks for being here and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.